Today we're looking at the Parramatta Female Factory, and we're running this as a conversation between myself, Emily, and the social history curator, writer and researcher Hendriksen, who has a special interest in the female factory. First, as always, we'll just do the acknowledgement of country. So, in the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. The other thing I'd just like to say too is that some of the topics and the subject matter today is a little bit difficult, and some people may find it triggering perhaps. If that is the case, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. So that's 13 11 14 for Lifeline. So just to set the scene, this is a picture of the female factory back in 1823. Today, the webinar is going to run this way. We're going to start with an overview. Start with the context. Then we're going to look at what a female factory was. How did you know that your ancestor was in the female factory system? What was life like inside the factory? What sorts of records are there? And then finally, how to use our website, that's the State Archives and Records website, and then using the records in our reading room for your research. So, Gay, what can you tell us about the context of the female factory?
Well, there's a great deal when you're looking at historical context. We will focus on the Parramatta Female Factory, but people who've come from other factory and ancestors will get a sense of it as well. We're looking at, just to remind people, we're looking at a period of massive change where you've got the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, failed Irish Revolution, Napoleonic Wars. You've got all those changes to agriculture and industry, and that's within the lives of the women themselves. It's in their group memory, in their experience. And then we're talking about a period where there was, there was the original transportation, and then with all the changes, there's that massive transportation program that occurs. And with that, over 24,960 convict women were transported to both New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. Now, the system itself, there were 13 factory sites in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, and it went from 1804 to 1856. We've estimated about 9,000 women experienced the female factories. That's at least to date. That more may come at another point. At least 5,000 went through the Parramatta Female Factory system, and that included the factory above the jail, the experimental factory, and the Macquarie Commission factory that we'll focus on today. Other factories service the local needs, but were also places of further punishment. And the Parramatta Female Factory itself was informed really by the ideas of prison reform by people like Elizabeth Fry, Jeremy Bentham and John Howard. So that's a little bit of a roundup.
Oops, sorry, my my turning was a little bit off there. So, what was a female factory?
Well, look, we have often just a general idea of it, but it had some quite specific aspects. So it was a new system of female incarceration. It was a bringing together of the bridewells and the houses of correction that had been really going since Elizabethan times, but not in this kind of form. And all the female factories that come into that 13, they did have a barrack, they did have a workroom, they did have a prison. But the Parramatta Female Factory had a great deal more than that. And the one that we're talking about today, the purpose-built factory, was 1821 to 1848. It had a barracks. It had a factory area, but it had workrooms for spinning and weaving. but there was linen and wool that was being woven. There was straw plaiting, sewing, knitting. The penitentiary class also broke rocks and picked oakum. It was also an assignment depot and a marriage bureau, sort of speed dating of the early 1800s, hospital, place of incarceration and of punishment. So that's a quick roundup of what a female factory is.
Wow, it's kind of a one-stop shop for everything, wasn't it?
It felt that way.
Okay, and how do you know?
So,
sorry, Gay.
Oh no, that's fine. It's this is the experience of the lag. Yeah, there were lots of factories, and we will be focusing on Parramatta. But please, you were about to ask a question.
Yeah, I was. I was about to just ask, how did you know that your ancestor was in the female factory system?
Right. Look, sometimes it's just serendipity, but as a researcher, there are three real main elements that I look at, and some of it's pretty basic, and many of you out there will do this automatically with your family history research. You know, did your ancestor come out by ship between 1788 and 1856? Though not everyone or the women went into the factory, they could have come out early and then gone into the 1804 factory or the 1820s. Where were they living? You know, were there localities where there were female factories? You know, why is it that your ancestor suddenly appears at Bathurst or Newcastle or Port Macquarie? You know, Moreton Bay, because that was part of New South Wales then. Emu Plains, that was a real experiment itself. You know, if they're there, maybe you could ask yourself, did they go to a factory? Van Diemen's Land, there were 5. There was Hobart, Newtown, which was the Cascades Female Factory, Launceston, Georgetown and Ross. And some of those women did, you know, there were some New South Wales women who went to Van Diemen's Land and some from Van Diemen's Land that went to New South Wales. And you can learn about both systems will inform the other. So the third thing is basically looking at your record. You know, does it say factory in your convict record? Does it say female factory? Does it say house of correction? Because sometimes that's used as well. Does it appear as a prison movement? You know, that you will find it in the records, but it really is detective work. So they're 3 ways that I use.
And Gay, would you, at the time, it might have been more common for them to say government factory rather than female factory? Would you sometimes see it written like that?
You would actually sometimes see it written like that, and you will find it in the newspapers as well. But I have found that State Archives is a gold mine. Look, sometimes it'll say cells, but it's very hard to go, okay, she says cells or Parramatta cells, but you can't say for certain that is factory because they were sometimes kept in the granary. They were sometimes kept in you know, the lockup and then sent. So there are a few ways that you can, but they're the most common ways I find.
Fabulous. It's a matter of following the trails of breadcrumbs, isn't it? And then the next question.
Absolutely.
The next question I've got is, what was life like in the female factory at Parramatta?
Right. Well, remember first that it covers nearly just over a quarter of a century, so things changed. It was that idea of the Bridewell and House of Correction. There was intent to, you know, for punishment and reform of what they called the disorderly poor, and that was through hard labour. There was a hospital combined. At Parramatta, it did include those at the time new ideas, like Elizabeth Fry's of reflection. And I mention her because she influenced the building as well as what happened inside. Originally, there was no class system, but for most of the time in the factory, there was a class system. And the first class was for new arrivals. Second class was those that were demoted from first or were promoted from second. And then there was a third class, the penitentiary class. And they were for, you know, there would have been convict women who would have committed another crime out here, or there might have been a free woman who committed a crime. There were children in the factory. We often forget that, it is also a children's story. When the children were very young, they stayed with the women early on, and then the older children were sent off to the orphan schools. But later, when you get to the late 1830s and the 40s, you will have older children. But, I can remember one statistic where there were 1,200 women in this factory and nearly 200 children. So, we still don't know entirely what they did with them. A lot of it is guesswork. Offences and punishment, of course. Common offences, small time, drunken, disorderly, absconding from assignment, continued drunkenness, pregnancy. It was obviously your fault if you were on assignment and you got pregnant. There was no one else involved. There was prostitution and serious crimes. It wasn't called prostitution because that wasn't punishable, but things related to that. And then later, of course, there was also theft and bodily harm and those serious crimes as well. Common punishments were solitary cells on bread and water, class demotion, cap of disgrace, head shaving. There were others, and I believe we might discuss that a little bit later. It was an assignment depot. These women went from the factory to the whole of the colony. It's not just an influence of one town. That's why it is such an important Australian story. It was a marriage bureau. Emancipated convicts and free men could apply for a wife, and indeed that was one way the women got out of the factory. So it really was, as you described, Emily, a one-stop shop. Sometimes it was disastrous for the women. It was like being in any prison now. There would be a system of, the women gangs within, people, doing deals, people who were well-behaved and benevolent workers at the factory who treated the women well. And then there were the corrupt and the nasty. So that's a little insight into life in the female factory.
Thank you, Gay. The next thing we've got is some records that can show you some more evidence of how life was in the factory at the time. So we thought we'd do a little bit of a show and tell and just talk a little bit about some of these records, which are all records from the State Archives collection. And the first group of records we've intended more just to show a general picture of what it could be like for a woman in the factory at the time. So this first picture we've got here is from the report of the Board of the Management of the factory from 1828, and it runs through the numbers of people that were in the factory. So first class women in 1828, there was 149. There was 155 in the second class and 161 in the third class. So that's 491 women when you include the 23 that were in the hospital, and there were 59 children, so over 500 people. Now, Gay, we talked earlier, and how many people was the factory actually built for?
Oh, 250.
So it's a little bit crowded.
That it was built for.
Yeah, 250. Wow. So
yeah,
it's definitely overcrowded.
It's interesting because the records... It is. And the records, I think, show both how things should be, but also how things were. And you won't find your answers in one set of records. Yeah. Very overcrowded.
Very overcrowded indeed. Next, what we've got is a return of the work done at the female factory. And this particular document comes from 1822 to December 1823. And the kind of work that they're listing are things that Gay was mentioning earlier. So woolen cloth that was manufactured, linen cloth that was manufactured. They were washing the refuse wool. They made 88 suits of slop clothing for the female prisoners. They made 414 new canvas bags. They mended 49 old canvas bags. They made bed furniture and window curtains and knitting. And we figure that when they're talking about bed furniture, they're talking about what we consider to be Manchester today. So it's not the bed, but probably more the sheets and the covers and those sorts of things, perhaps the curtains that went around some lucky people's beds, possibly not if you were in the female factory though. And they also made 16 pairs of woolen socks for individuals. So they did keep them very busy, didn't they?
Oh, they certainly did. And when you're thinking about the main weaving, they were weaving wool and linen, and then also linsey woolsey, which is linen and wool together. And that's then interlinked with the economy of the place too, because we are talking about one of our earliest manufacturing places. So it's industrial history as well.
Yeah, so it is an actual physical factory. The next example that we've got is an example from a returns of punishments in 1827. And you can see here the women are listed along with the names of their ships. The number in the column next to that is whether they're in first, second or third class. And you can see the sorts of crimes that they were committing here, things like neglect of work, disobedience to the monitress, insolence, swearing. There's a couple of turning from running away. Gay, did you want to talk about Joanna and Ellen Cheatham, who were the returns there from running away at the end of 1827?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think we think of them as just another record sometimes, but this is, if you look at the date on this, it's after the 1827 female workers' action or riot, and those two women have got 2 months on bread and water. And they were indeed two of the escapees from that riot. And I think there's, apart from being an amazing moment in our history, I find for family historians, this is a great gold mine for finding out if your ancestor actually went through the factory. You just hope that they're a little bit naughty so that they can be recorded here, because this definitely says they were here. But it certainly tells you about our Australian history.
Yeah, and you don't want them too naughty because you don't want them to get punished too much.
Correct.
The next document to show you is just a weekly report from the hospital. And this tells you, so we're thinking it's 1826. We know that in 1828, it's got double the number of people in this building that should have been there anyway, which I suppose in our current environment of the pandemic, it's just the horrors of being overcrowded. And then the sorts of illnesses that were recorded were things like ulcers, dysentery, syphilis, diarrhea, abscesses, and so on, ophthalmia. And so I suppose, I don't know, is 18 a good number of people to be sick out of that many? But just a range of illnesses. This particular week seems to have been quite good because no one passed away, but there certainly were deaths in the factory.
Absolutely. This I hate to say, but this is a reasonably good record of what was like with the hospital. I've seen also typhoid, dysentery, diphtheria, consumption in there. And don't forget, this hospital is the same place where those babies are being born as well. So very difficult. And some of the convict women were nurses, but they also had a midwife employed as well. But really difficult. I hate to say this was a reasonably good record, but it is.
Yes, that's so true. The next thing we've got is another page from the report of the Board of Management of the Female Factory. And this one's talking about the children who were born. So, that story of hope with the children being born in the factory. So 24 had been born up to 1829, the last 6 months in 1829. 22 children, 17 of whom were illegitimate, have died in the same period. One of them wasn't entered into the surgeon's returns as the child expired before the surgeon was apprised of the illness. And you do see attitudes of the time start to come through in the records as well, which is quite interesting. So this next sentence is telling, I think. So the surgeon does not hesitate to express his belief that a part of the deaths was occasioned by the inhuman treatment which the infants experienced from their mothers, who, being constrained by existing regulations to remain in the factory, to nurse and take care of their offspring. So it's a little bit sad, isn't it?
Look, it's very sad, and it does show that, you know, that sense that, oh, the women don't look after their children, but there are other records that show that they really, you know, they really care for their children. They did everything they could to support it. But this record really does show, doesn't it, that that prejudice against the women was alive and well within the running of the factory.
Absolutely, absolutely. The next record that we've got to show you possibly shows that attitude coming through quite clearly. In 1826, a woman called Mary Ann Hamilton died at the factory, and there was a coroner's inquest into her death, and there was actually a second inquest also into the same death. The first verdict indicated that she died by the visitation of God. And then some weeks after she was buried, a second verdict was returned, indicating that she died by starvation and ill usage. They say that the deceased appeared to be in a decline for some weeks, in a feeble state, and from the evidence produced, they were of the opinion that she died of a gradual decline. And this document also goes on to say that after evidence given by William Tuckwell, who was the secretary of the factory at the time, it was impossible to entertain a doubt that Mrs. Falloon, who was the matron, or some persons acting under her, had been in almost constant practice of appropriating to her or their side some portions of the rations allowed to the prisoners. The Secretary has no separate stores in which to keep provisions allowed by the government to the prisoner. The consequence is that every night and at all times on his leaving the factory, the key of the store is delivered up to Mrs. Falloon. And the story that unravelled with the investigation into her death really seems to bear this out, that there was a system of those in power within a factory appropriating the best food and the bigger quantity of the food, while those who weren't part of that group certainly suffered greatly, and in Mary Ann Hamilton's case, died from that practice. And it's a really sad story.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you there. I think it shows two things. You get someone like William Tuckwell, who's actually a good employee, who's trying to whistleblow and say, look, this is not right, what's happening, and then the other occurring. This particular event, Mary Ann Hamilton, was the spark that ignited the what became that 1827 right. But it really there was a case of, you know, good matrons with unfortunate husbands who as well were just fleecing the place in more ways than one.
And then we've got some of the evidence from that inquest, and there is quite a bit of evidence, so we had to sift it down just to show a very small portion of that. So a lot of the constables who were constables guarding the women in the factory were questioned, and their evidence survives. So this document here is from Stephen Smith, who was one of the jurors. He had been a constable at the factory, and he'd also been a servant of the Reverend Samuel Marsden, who was on the committee of management for the factory. He states he knew the deceased. He was attached to the factory. He never observed that she was particularly sick, but she did appear to be from time to time flighty, but not very troublesome. She would often say she didn't have enough victuals to eat. He had seen her picking up bones and cabbage stumps that had been thrown away to eat. He'd seen her eat those, and he'd also seen her eat a weed that grows within the walls, and several more women that were now in the factory had done the same besides the deceased. So there were several people doing this as well. When the women vexed her, Mary Ann would be noisy, and she had a loud manner of speaking. So you see some of her personality pop through there. She often had her tea stopped for making a noise by the orders of Mrs. Falloon, which would cause her to fret. Several women besides her made complaints of hunger as well, and Stephen Smith knew some of the women through hunger to pilfer the mixture made for a goose to eat, and they'd eaten it and been confined for doing so. And some had also begged for cabbage stumps when they'd promised they'd done some work. So there's this real picture of some of these women being very hungry. We also know from another deposition that Marianne was tied to a bed which was tied to the floor, and that she died in her cell. So I don't know, Gay, if you've got more to add to that story.
Oh, look, I think it shows clearly that the women might be incarcerated, but some of them were definitely victims, like Marianne Hamilton. But even her, it was her voice. You know, she kept on having her rations reduced because she'd voiced her ideas and her opinions. She voiced the issues that she was having, and you can see that, you know, that thing of the government in that particular factory trying to quieten the women, trying to stop the women from speaking out, and that just a disastrous time that you see in the factory. This is one that we know because she died, but there would be many stories that we don't know because, you know, they just lived through it. So these records, I think, you know, really give you an insight.
Yeah. One thing that came through to me from reading it was just several witnesses kept quoting her as saying, "For God's sake, just give me some food." And that really stuck with me. I found that very haunting. Poor Mary, Anne. It's very sad. And just that
Each one of these records is a person's life, and I think that's the really important thing. And that's the joy for me, is the family historians connecting with those stories and bringing them to life again, and having these wonderful records that we can access at state records for it as well.
Yeah.
That's such a sad story. You can't not be moved by it.
Absolutely. It brings shivers up your spine. So as part of the inquiry that ensued into the running of the factory after this inquest, all of the constables and the various people involved with running the factory were questioned. And this is just one document where Matron Falloon is being questioned about what matters are like within the factory. Do the women ever bathe? No, there's no convenience. Are the women ever inspected with regard to the cleanliness of their persons? Which is interesting when they never bathed. And she says yes, frequently. So she orders the monitors to do it every Saturday, and occasionally she and the nurses do it themselves. What facilities have the women for washing themselves? None, but there is a trough in the yard, and they have a sufficient allowance of soap issued weekly. Do they have any towels, combs or brushes? No, they don't have any. And are the women allowed to see their friends? On Thursday mornings, those that warranted the privilege would be allowed to see their friends. So there you are.
It really does give you an indication, doesn't it? You get the regulations as they should be, which is one kind of record, and then you get this record that tells you something else, and you can add to that this is part of a full inquiry into the factory. They also didn't have any shoes, they weren't getting enough fresh water or enough food, and so it was a very damning inquiry.
Yeah, very. And did things change a little bit after this?
Look, it went up and down. It went up and down. You still had William Tuckwell was there for years. He tried to still, you know, maintain that as he could, but he was within the bounds of his bosses. Matron Gordon follows on, and she, you know, she institutes, you know, a rule of law. But she has a husband who, you know, is not unlike Falloon's husband, and so corruption continues. So, you know, the women are in a lose-lose. It's like you were saying with the washing, you know, yeah, you've got to wash yourself, but if you haven't got anything to wash yourself, how can you follow the regulation of washing yourself?
It's all a bit crazy town, The next document that we've got to show you is from 1838. Gay, did you want to talk? This is a letter from a man called John Clapham. Did you want to talk a little bit about John Clapham and who he was?
Oh yes, John Clapham. You love him and you hate him. I think he had desire to have power. John Clapham and Matron Leach were the two people who were selected by Elizabeth Fry to come out, the only two of all the employees, and right from the get-go, even on board ship, he complains that she's a bit of a lush, and it carries on over here. And so the thing we love about him is that he sends at least on one occasion, an 11-page letter complaining about what's happening in the factory. And so it gives us some great insights as well as their toing and froing. Their problems become a lovely little resource for us to see what's happening. But it's also about personalities governing the period, because these are the people who are affecting the lives of the women. And I think there's some interesting little bits in there that maybe you want to share, Emily.
Yeah, just a couple of quotes from the letter. So you've got to remember, it's not just this particular page of litany of abuses. There's pages and pages and pages of how the women there are just abusing the system. So we've got Grace Lynch, a monitor in the second class. When she received her meat from the store, she threw it to the ground, kicked it about with her feet, and made use of the most dreadful oaths I've ever heard. The turnkey was with her, and instead of correcting her, just laughed at her. On the 11th of March, which was a Sunday, he'd seen a prisoner in the third class reading aloud the Sydney Gazette. He also saw a prisoner come from the second class with a pint of milk, which had been given for the children, for the gatekeeper's servant, who frequently goes to Parramatta alone. And so it goes on. And he concludes his letter by saying, I submit these to your excellency, believing you are not put in possession of the true state of the factory. I might have given your excellency a much more lengthened account, these being only a few of the abuses I've seen. I believe there is not a luxury in the colony the prisoners in the factory do not enjoy. So it's quite a different picture from quite a different place to those people in 1826 reporting what was happening to the women inside the factory.
Yes, I think he felt that they were getting it very easy, but we're talking about a time when, you know, we've got nearly 1,200 women in that factory for 250. So I think he's just, yes, just one of those. He also, I think, saw a woman with her arms around a chimney sweep as well, and that wasn't allowed.
Definitely not.
Yeah, but it shows you the changes.
Yeah, definitely.
It definitely shows the changes over time. And these are all personalities. They're individuals interacting with individuals.
Yep, that is true. So the next part of the talk, we're going to talk about what records there are. So I think, Gay, you wanted to have a bit of a chat about that as a researcher.
Yeah. Look, I thought it just might be handy to just mention a couple of things. And look, for many of you out there, you'll know these things and you'll probably be doing them already, but I think it's always good to do a little recount. If I'm looking up a factory woman, the first thing I'll do is go to the convict records and the things we all know, the indents, the tickets of leave, certificates of freedom, the conditional and absolute pardons, seeing what is there. Then because there was no list that just says who went into the factory, then you start to extend out to other things like records relating to the individuals. Yep, the natural, the births, the marriages, but there's also the children's records. And so, stories come through the children and through the husbands as well. You get the general records. The musters are a gold mine because they will say if the woman comes from the factory. Then you get a little bit of general what was happening from the colonial government perspective. If you have a look at the blue books, they might give you some clues. The court system, there were benches of magistrates, courts of petty sessions, the court of sessions. You've got the Supreme Court. Most of the crimes that women did were petty ones, but they are still recorded somehow in the court system. Of course, the prison records, and don't just stick with the prison that your ancestor, you might know that she went to Newcastle, but she probably went to Parramatta beforehand. You might know she went to Parramatta, but she might have come through Darlinghurst Jail, so you could check the prison records. The Colonial Secretary's papers are, to me, the absolute gold mine, but this is when you really are doing the detective work because you're looking at, the letters received, the copies of letters sent, you're looking at special bundles, you're looking at memorials and petitions and reports and returns and all the things that Emily knows about so well. So I might get you to talk the indexes, Emily, because I think that's something you can really talk to.
Yeah, no problem. So there's been a few indexes that are so helpful for researching the women in the female factory. I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge the work that Joan Rees and Norma Tuck have done in their index to the female factory at Parramatta, which covers records 1826 to 1848. These are mainly to do with records of punishment that they index back at the time. But there are other indexes that we've found to be extremely helpful in conjunction with Joan and Norma's index as well. So the biggie, of course, as Gay was saying, is the Colonial Secretary's papers. The Colonial Secretary, if you don't know, was a very central office in New South Wales. It started as the Secretary to the Governor and then evolved into an even more encompassing office, I suppose, where most matters that were dealt with by government in New South Wales in the 19th century went through the Colonial Secretary's office. So whether you were a convict seeking to have your sentence ended, or if you were an employer looking for a convict, or if you were someone looking for a land grant, or if you were seeking work, or if you were seeking a railway pass, or later on if you had family going into a mental hospital, all of those sorts of things went through the Colonial Secretary's office. And certainly there's a lot of mentions of women going into the female factory as well. And the factory had to report to the Colonial Secretary. So you pick up a lot of reports and punishments and returns being lists of people in a particular situation at a certain time. They're all in the Colonial Secretary's papers. So there's a couple of indexes there that are very useful. There's an index on our website which covers the years 1788 to 1825, and we'll have a bit of a look at that later. And that's pretty much a name index. So if you know the name of the people that you're looking for, you can look up the name and see which documents we have picked or indexed from that early period. And then Joan Rees also indexed the Colonial Secretary's papers from 1826, and she was looking at names and identifying those names by the name of the ship that they came out on or some other piece of information about that person, and she continued that index up until 1895. And so that's a really useful tool for getting into records about the female factory as well as is the index to letters sent to the sheriff, which covers the years 1828 to 50. The sheriff at the time was very responsible for all the things that happened in prisons in New South Wales. And so he would be informed about prisoners moving around, people going to the female factory and that kind of thing.
Okay, what Emily and I thought we would do now is just take a peek into some of the lives of the women through the process of what kind of records we might look at, and these would be samples of records that that you might come across with your particular ancestor. This first one you're looking at is actually, the classic indent from the ship Elizabeth that and Eliza O'Brien came out on. And Eliza was really in and out of the factory, had a difficult life inside and outside, and the records really tell that story. Emily, you might talk a little about the records.
Yeah, sure. So the convict indent is really like the shipping list for a convict coming out to New South Wales. And they'll tell us a lot of the background of the person, so their native place, what their occupation was, what their offence was, where and when they were tried, and what their sentence was. So a lot of people were given 7 or 14-year sentences, or they might get a life sentence. And later on, from about the mid-1820s, you also get the beautiful physical description with their heights, their complexion, their hair colour, eye colour, and other sorts of comments. And so here we've got Eliza O'Brien, fresh-faced at 23, coming out from committing her crime in Tipperary. And she goes into the female factory, I think, on board from the Elizabeth. Is that right, Gay?
Yeah, she does. She's in the factory quite a few times, and her life. I mean, she marries an Edward Duggan who ends up with syphilis and goes insane, and then so his records will also relate to her. She has a child that survives, and he ends up next door to the factory. She steals again, and then she goes to Moreton Bay. So yes, she's definitely in those records.
With an eventful life. Oops, there we go.
It was, and sad in many ways.
Yeah. Here we've got an application for the marriage, a report by the local reverend for marriage bans. This report went to the Colonial Secretary, and in this report they had to state all the couples that applied to get married by bans, and then they had to provide some sort of background, and if they were convicts they had to show whether they were reported as married or single. If they were married, they certainly couldn't get permission to marry. If they were single, they could. And sometimes you get some beautiful background about that convict as well. So with Eliza, this links her definitely to the Female Factory. We see here that in 1829, 1830, and again in 1830, she's sent to the third class of the Female Factory 3 times. The first time she's sent to the third class for 6 weeks. She's absent without leave and found in a public house drinking, which is why she goes to third class. She gets another 6 weeks in April 1830 for being frequently drunk and absent without leave. And then finally in September, she gets 3 months in the third class for drunken and disorderly conduct.
So I would say, Emily, that whether the application was accepted or not, it's definitely a place to look, because you will find lots of information. So this is one of the ways I would find out about whether they were in the factory. But you wouldn't expect that, not from a marriage application.
No, that's right. But here they were looking at their backgrounds to see if they were able to get married. And these records cover 1826 to 1842, so it's smack bang in factory time. And they're also indexed by the names of both parties in the couple on microfiche, and you can find that microfiche in our reading room. But certainly a valuable way to potentially confirm if someone had been a factory lady or not. Here what we've got is a letter sent to the Colonial Secretary by Elizabeth Duggan. We did go back and check whether she could read or write by checking her indent, and we don't think she could, so she's possibly paid someone to write this letter for her. And what's happened here is in 1836, she'd been married as Gay, as we saw and as Gay said, but the marriage wasn't a very safe one for her. It was quite violent. Her husband had syphilis. He was sent to the benevolent asylum. She was left alone. She had a 2-year-old son. She steals and she gets sentenced to go up to Moreton Bay. And she writes this letter asking for the indulgence to take her 2-year-old boy with her, as she's got no one in the colony to take care of her child, except if she's allowed to take him with her. And she hopes that she'll be allowed to do this. And she was allowed to take her little boy.
Yeah, I think this is a great example, both of, how important the Colonial Secretary letters are for finding information, but also this is evidence of, the mother that really cares so much and she wants to have her baby with her. It was a successful letter. I'll just let you know it there that she was able to take him. But what would have happened if she wasn't? And she loved her children despite the life she had and the decisions she made, and that someone else wrote the letter, scribed the letter for her. You can see the love of that woman coming through in the records.
Yeah, you certainly can. The next document is a little bit earlier. So this is 1822. We've got Elizabeth Browning Owen, and she came out, she had children with her. The children were put into the orphan school. And Gay, did you want to talk about these records quickly a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it shows you, another kind of experience in the factory, because this woman was bringing out 4 children. One was supposed to stay in England because it was too old at age 9, but the surgeon superintendent allowed it. So she goes through that pain of, will I have that 4th child with me or not? She has them, she brings them out here. All 4 are taken away from her when she gets to the factory. And, clearly from the records, she wants those children back. Her way was to actually marry. And when she marries, that means that she's assigned to her husband. She marries through that speed dating, through the application to marry. But it was a long and successful marriage, it appears through the records. But it meant that within 12 months, she could have her children back with her, instead of them going, to other, to go to the other orphanages and not see them for the sentence. So she's using the system, and you can see that through the records. And what's interesting about this is, you look up her records, it's probably, there's a very small number of records, but if you look up her husband's records, because he's the one who has been a convict and is free, he then applies to take the children out of the orphanages. And so you find her life in under Emmanuel Marvin's records and his life as well. So always remember, don't just stay with your factory woman and her names and stories. Don't forget to spread through her children and her husband's records, and not just the marriage ones.
Absolutely, so important. This is just an example from the 1828 census, and all the female factory women at the time were recorded together. You can see it's a government factory that they say. We see their names, their ages, whether they were convicts or not, their ship and year of arrival, and also their length of sentence and their religion. So another way to identify if someone was in the factory would be by looking at their musters or census records.
Yes, I found the musters and census records really helpful. Just because it is quite clear where they were in the factory. Even if they're not grouped together like this, just going through the census, you can see if at a certain time they were in the factory. Okay, they're helpful.
Very much so. Then we've just got a couple of quick petitions to show you. So this first one is, again, a petition that was sent to the Colonial Secretary. So this is from a woman called Mary Hindle, and she was sending a petition to request to be allowed to be free, because she had a lot of the people she'd been transported with were already granted their freedom, but she hadn't been. So she sends this most descriptive letter to the Colonial Secretary. Did you want to say some more about Mary Hindle?
Yes, she was one of those women who didn't cope with coming out here. She left her child and husband behind. There are 1,000 rioters and 9 sent out, and she's the only one not given permission to leave the factory. She does end up committing suicide, so it's very, very sad. But you can see her voice in, I won't read all of it because it's up there for people to look at, but, I humbly implore your excellency to include me in the number who've received the blessing of your clemency. Then she says, and I think this always resonates with me too, "Oh, don't suffer me to languish the remains of my existence in hopeless slavery." There's no doubt there what she is thinking the factory is. And alas, my poor children suffer. Again, a woman who just misses her family so much, and she's in a place that she can't cope with, and she's being denied by the government. So sad story. But again, the petition's a great way to find out about your factory woman.
And to hear their voices.
Absolutely. Hear their voices so clearly, I think.
Yeah, definitely. The last example that we've got is a bit more of a positive example. We didn't want to leave you on a totally negative side. And again, this is just an underlining the value of the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. This is a petition about a girl called Constance, and she was the youngest female prisoner transported to New South Wales, we think, and certainly the youngest female admitted into the factory as a prisoner. So she was 9 when she arrived in New South Wales, so she was very young. She was a woman of colour, and this petition is to do with she and another girl, Elizabeth, who was transported out with her in 1834 on the Dart. And the decision was made to assign the two girls together because they were so young and to keep them together. And I believe, Gay, she ended up having a really good life.
She did, and look, there's a great story that goes with it. And this is a reminder too that it's not just the British Isles. She came from Mauritius, so anywhere there was colonial government, there could be a prisoner that comes to Australia, and was powder in the tea. She also could have been a viscountess, and there's a record relating to that. But her story is that as this particular record shows, she's assigned to Colonel Wilson, who really supported her right through her life. And when she applied to marry, he supported that as well. And then she marries a man called Robert Trudgett, and ends up having 11 children and being a midwife in New South Wales near Wellington. So, positive stories too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And it's a nice way to end the examples, I think. We just wanted to show quickly just what the Colonial Secretary's indexes look like. So this is just a couple of snips from the 1788 to 1825 index, which is on our website. You can just see you look the name up, so alphabetical by surname, and then for each person, it tries to identify them perhaps by the name of their ship, if you can. And then for each document, it says a little bit about what the document is about, its date, where on the microfilm you can find that. And these days, these papers are also copied onto the Ancestry website, which I know is a subscriber site, but many public libraries in New South Wales provide free access, and we also provide free access here in the reading room. So it's a valuable source, and you can also look up some of the institutions. So if you look up Parramatta, Female Factory, you will find out some general information about the Female Factory. And Gay, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I thought I'd just add, it's a visual example. You can see there's more records with her husband than when you singly look up her. So I think that's a great example.
Absolutely. And sometimes women, the way things were in the 19th century, you do need to trace the husband to trace where the wife was as well. This is a little picture of Constance, by the way, and this is this is the later Joan Rees index to the Colonial Secretary's papers, which is available on CD, and you can search that in a few ways. And so we see here, I've just searched. We had trouble picking her up, so I've actually just done a search on the name of the ship, and then we can see that Constance is in there under Constance, Constantia, Du Sablemer, Constance, and she's also there under Stantia, a negress. And we're fairly sure that's all the same person. And so then it was just a matter of using the references there on the right-hand side to go and look at each of those letters, one of which we showed you a little bit earlier. So it's a wonderful source, wonderful source.
It's a reminder of looking up the different names as well, because I think she also had Corone, so you could miss it if you stuck with one or two ways of looking for her with the name.
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about the names, that it's really important to when you're doing research, be creative with your names, your spellings. Just because she's recorded one way in one record doesn't mean that someone else hasn't written the name slightly differently or heard it differently or something else. So you do find a lot more spelling variation in the 19th century than what we do certainly now when we're all a lot better educated and in this age of computers.
I'd add there too, Emily, that the fact that you looked up the ship, so finding a different way in can also be helpful as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing you could do is search under the surnames, the married name, the single name, and any variations thereof. Okay, so we'll just very quickly talk about the website. So our website is records.nsw.gov.au. We have some research guides in our Research A to Z, the Female Factory Guide and the Convict Guides, which are very useful for checking what kinds of records that we hold. And then we've also got in our online indexes to convicts, indexes to child protection, and the Early Colonial Secretaries Index. So all of those are quite useful when looking up your female factory people. So this is our homepage on our website. You'll know that by the picture currently of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. If you click on the quick links there, which I've circled in red, you'll see a quick link to our online indexes, our Research A to Z, and also to the webinar. So if you clicked on webinars, you'd go to our webinar library, which possibly some of you have done to register for this. In our Research A to Z, if you go to F for female, you'll get taken down to the F section, and then you can just click on Female Factory and you'll get taken straight to our guide. And similarly, you could go to C for convicts or wherever else you might need to go. And the guides really just give you a clue as to the kinds of records that are useful for that particular topic. In this case, the female factory. So you see a list of the kinds of records that we hold, the date ranges that they cover, a link to our catalogue to find out a more detailed description, and then also the library the number, which is like our library catalogue number, but we call it our item number. And if it's microfilmed, you'll see the real number there as well. Some of these things would be copied onto the Ancestry website. So some things you can look at from your local library, or if you've got a subscription yourself, you can look at those there. But you can always come into our reading room to view those documents as well. Some of the Colonial Secretaries papers that I was showing you before, a lot of those are not microfilmed, so you would need to physically come into the reading room to view those. And I'll show you how to do that in 1 second. On our homepage too, if you scroll down further than the Sydney Harbour Bridge, you'll see some other links that can be useful to find out information. So I've just circled 3 that are handy for people doing research into female factory records. Our link to convict guides, our link to the census and muster records, and also the Colonial Secretary. And those links will take you straight to any guides that we hold on that subject, as well as any indexes that are also available for searching on that subject. A special shout out to our convict guide. This is our big convict guide in our reading room. Gay's just wanting to say a quick word about that herself.
Oh, yeah, I have to say, I just love this guide because, one, you've got some great signposts to the female factory, but also to shipping and to other convict records. That I think it's a fabulous guide. So, and I believe it's online. I know it's online now, so you too can access it.
Absolutely. So very handy, not just for female factory people, but for if you've got a convict, so researching convicts generally, and you'll find that by clicking on that little box that says convicts further down on our website, as I was just showing you on the previous slide. Now, visiting the reading room. Our reading room is at Kingswood, which is near Penrith at the base of the Blue Mountains. Currently, we're only open by appointment, so you do need to make an appointment before you come. We're open Tuesday to Friday, 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and Saturdays 10 till 4. The day is broken up into 2 sessions, so Monday morning is 9 till 12:30 and afternoon is 1 till 5, and Saturday's morning is 10 till 12:30 and afternoon is 1 till 4. So you do need to make an appointment. You'll see that what I've just put onto this page is just a little snip from our website. So if you go to the Visit tab, you'll come up with this page here and you'll see that big red box that says Make an Appointment. So if you click on there, you'll go straight to the software to make the appointment. And then after that, if you know the records you want to see and they're not copied, you can pre-order those before you come in, and we can have those ready and waiting for you so that you save some time. You can request records when you do arrive. It will just take the time that it takes for us to go and pull those and bring them back to the reading room for you. Now, if you can't visit, we don't offer a research service, but we do offer a copy service for many of our online indexes. And the other thing you can do is arrange for someone to come on your behalf. So if you've got a lovely, kind friend who's willing to do that for you, you're very lucky. But people do pay researchers as well. We can't recommend anyone for you, but we can send you to a couple of other organisations that do maintain lists of professional researchers. And for female factory ancestors, there are a few other places where you can look. So places like the Trove website, the National Library of Australia's website, where they've digitised newspapers and government gazettes, is amazing. The Ancestry website, Find My Past, Family Search websites, the State Library, the Society of Australian Genealogists, and there are a few community websites for the female factory as well. And so they provide a lot of information about the background to the factory, some of the people who were involved. You'll find essays about the factory. So there's a lot of resources out there as well. Local libraries look in their local studies collection. I think particularly Parramatta, the heritage collection there, but I'd imagine that wherever there was a female factory, so Port Macquarie, Newcastle would be other things as well. And Gay, did you want to add something there?
Oh, look, I think any large local studies library, I like Penrith is fabulous, but even the Blue Mountains, like lots of, and family history societies are wonderful places.
Absolutely. And there's published books as well. So you find some of those online and in your local library, and the Historical Records of Australia. So there's a lot of sources out there, but it really is that detective trail of just putting together all your clues to try and build that big picture of, or little picture of the women who were there. And that brings us to the end of our Female Factory webinar. We're so pleased that we've been able to get to present this one. It's been wonderful.